Through the history of Brazil, it is possible to note over the centuries the great importance of the Portuguese influence, starting with the discovery of Brazil on the 22nd of April 1500 by the explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral. For example, the name Brazil was given in the 16th century to the new land in honor of the pau-brasil tree, whose trade was the first form of exploitation of the colony. After the so-called pre-colonial period, in 1534 Brazil became an actual colony, and it was divided into captaincies. Therefore, Portuguese, which is now the official language of Brazil, was introduced and then gradually replaced the more than 1,000 indigenous languages spoken by the many native tribes, after a period in which mixed languages, called general languages, were created and spoken. The so-called Brazilian Portuguese, however, is nothing more than an internal evolution of the language, expressed with a slightly different spelling compared to that of Portugal, which the Portuguese-speaking countries tried to unify in 1990 through a treaty. The Portuguese colonizers enslaved and exterminated entire tribes of indigenous Brazilians, but later became interested in the African slave trade between the 16th and 17th centuries. In spite of the abolition of slavery in 1888, following the evolution of the society, the conflicts between slaves and the new class of the landowners that produced coffee, and the struggles against slavery of great abolitionists, nowadays in Brazil the descendants of former African and indigenous slaves are discriminated against, since the ancient Portuguese defined themselves as European purebloods as opposed to other contaminated inferior races. Moreover, the Jesuit missionaries who arrived along with the Portuguese colonizers founded some of Brazil's major cities, such as São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. However, their main purpose was to spread the word of God through Catholicism. Nowadays, in fact, the most widespread religion in Brazil is Catholicism, followed by Protestantism, also because of the arrival of evangelical missionaries in the Amazon in the 20th century. Brazil, declared independent in 1822, remained ruled by some members of the Portuguese royal family, which weakened over time until the Republic was declared in 1891 through a coup. It was clear that Brazil was attempting to become completely independent from its colonizers and to restore its origins by changing the type of government. In fact, the monarchy became a federal republic. Moreover, during the First Brazilian Republic, favelas were built, and nowadays they are still present in large numbers and are a symbol of the country's poverty and crime. Another coup led to the military dictatorship in 1964. Despite a false sign of economic growth, Brazil lived through 20 years of censorship and suspension of civil and political rights. Despite the different historical, political, and social context, we can see similarities between the Brazilian military regime and the Portuguese dictatorship. Moreover, despite Brazil was an independent country and despite the racism against Portuguese immigrants in Brazil, who reminded of the ancient colonizers, the Brazilian army was the first to recognize the Portuguese Revolution. After some negotiations, the Brazilian government accepted to permanently host the two main politicians of the former Portuguese dictatorship. After the end of the Brazilian dictatorship, the civil government tried to restore the economy until it collapsed around 2011. In addition, many politicians and major Brazilian companies have been accused of corruption. However, corruption is not Brazil's peculiarity, but it came with the Portuguese colonizers when the King of Portugal offered incentives to the colonists, whose actions were not controlled in the new land. This led to a corrupted environment. Therefore, in order to understand the history of Brazil, we must take into account how Portugal superficially exploited and impoverished the new land. Even after the various attempts to expand and improve the major cities during the imperial period, the poorest part of the population was continuously neglected. On the contrary, the army and the church became more and more powerful, along with new dominant social classes which exploited slaves and lands. Nowadays, Brazil is, in fact, a direct consequence of the actions of the Portuguese, and it would be impossible to get rid of its Portuguese roots. If this were to happen, Brazil would, in fact, lose its identity, particularly in the socio-cultural sphere. In fact, for example, the indigenous communities, which already lived in Brazil before the Portuguese arrived, are now almost extinct, and very few Brazilians can speak an indigenous language.